What's your name?
I didn't give it.
I know. I want to know what your name is.
I don't care what you want.
Well,
that's not the policy.
The Secret Service.
I don't care.
Us to identify
then why don't they come out here and talk to me?
They will in a moment.
Okay, go ahead. Am I being detained?
In the fall of 2022, a video uploaded to YouTube showed an interaction between an unnamed photographer and Sergeant Juan Barrientos of the Fort Wayne Police Department in Indiana. The latter approached the man as he was taking pictures before a rally held for Donald Trump in the area. Barrientos asked that the man identify himself, claiming that he was acting under instructions from the Secret Service. But the latter pointed out that he was under no obligation to do so unless he was detained or charged with a crime. He then tried to walk away, but Barrientos prevented him from doing so by putting his arm on him, an action that was met with protest by the photographer, who sternly and repeatedly asked the officer not to touch him.
What's your name?
Am I being detained?
What is your name?
Am I being detained?
What is your
I'm going
name?
to assume no.
What's that?
I'm going to say, hey, don't you touch me. Don't you touch me. Public servant,
What?
don't touch me.
What?
Look, public servant, you don't touch me.
All right.
You don't touch me.
Or else what?
You don't touch me.
Or else what?
I will file a complaint.
You can file a complaint.
Don't
but
touch
I'm going
me.
to identify you.
As their interaction progressed, Barrientos called for backup, but the man continued to act in accordance with his rights and, in spite of repeated requests from law enforcement, didn't give them his name. He relentlessly asked, "Am I being detained or am I free to go?" before the power-tripping officer eventually allowed him to walk away. The photographer then told Barrientos that he would be filing a complaint, to which the officer replied that it wouldn't be the first. Number 6. Gustavo Albina. An officer of the New Mexico State Police conducted a traffic stop for speeding in Las Cruces on April the 7th of 2021. In the vehicle, Officer Gustavo Albina encountered a group of female teenagers, one of whom was behind the wheel and didn't have her license. The cop asked her to step out and test her sobriety after he spotted empty beer cans in the car and determined that the group smelled of alcohol. He told the 18-year-old driver, who'd been crying, "I see alcohol in your eyes," and conducted several more tests. Albina concluded that some of the teens' parents had to be called to the scene to retrieve them because there was alcohol in the car, and he assumed none of them was fit to drive. One of the teens, identified as 18-year-old Cagle, then asked the cop how he knew they were all drunk, stating, "It's empty cans, sir." In the moments that followed, Albina grabbed her by the arm, took her to the back of his cruiser, and told her that she was arrested and would go to jail.
I'm sorry, there's no proof of full cans? How, no.
Come here. Come here.
No.
Come here.
Sir, I'm just asking you.
Tired of you, okay? You argue too much, you're gonna get in my car. Yes.
No, sir,
Get in
I'm
the
just
car.
asking you a question.
Sit down in the back.
Sir, I'm just asking you
Sit down in
a
the back.
question.
Sit down in the back.
No, I'm just asking you a question.
By then, one of the teens' mothers had arrived at the scene, and Albina claimed that he was taking Cagle into custody for being kind of rude and arguing the whole time. He allowed the others to leave and then told Cagle, who was crying and apologizing repeatedly, that he had to handcuff her before going to the station. When the teen asked the cop about what she'd done, Albina claimed she was the only one with the attitude. He gave Cagle permission to talk to her mother and then spoke to the woman himself. While the latter was telling Albina that her daughter was unstable and might have a mental breakdown, Cagle started banging her head against the partition, as recorded by the vehicle surveillance cameras. In spite of her state of distress, Albina told the teen's mother she looks fine. He then dragged Cagle outside the vehicle and handcuffed her, claiming he was doing it so that she wouldn't hurt herself. The teen eventually calmed down and Albina called an ambulance to check on her before she was booked into jail on the charge of minor in possession of alcohol. Number 5. Kevin Morris. Following an internal investigation carried out in July of 2019, a police officer in Montgomery County, Maryland, was charged with second-degree assault and misconduct in office. The accusations against Kevin Morris stem from the arrest of 19-year-old Arnaldo Andres Pessoa on July the 3rd of 2019. The latter had been contacted by an undercover officer on Snapchat, and a deal had been arranged for the purchase of psychedelic mushrooms. A meetup was arranged at a McDonald's where Morris and other officers in plain clothes approached Pessoa. They told the teen that he was under arrest, but he resisted and was eventually taken down. After officers had handcuffed Pessoa on the sidewalk outside the McDonald's, Morris grabbed the teen's ear and forced his knee into his neck area, slamming his head into the pavement. A bystander recorded Morris, who was at the time in his early 30s, as he continued applying pressure to Pessoa's neck. The man was left with injuries to his face in the aftermath. He ultimately pleaded guilty to attempting to sell psilocybin mushrooms. Morris went to trial in December of 2019. He motivated his actions by saying that Pessoa had been spitting blood at him, thus putting him and his fellow officers at risk of contracting infectious diseases. Morris was found guilty of second-degree assault and given 2 years of probation. In 2020, Pessoa sued Morris and Montgomery County over the incident, but the matter was pending as of subsequent information released to the media. In 2021, Morris was given probation before judgment, a type of relief often afforded to people in Maryland with little to no criminal record who'd been convicted of relatively minor crimes. It meant that the previous guilty finding was cleared from his record and that he retained his position with the police department. Number 4. Arrest of Jamara Garcia. Law enforcement in Westminster, California, received a call on April the 21st of 2021, accompanied by reports that a woman had been assaulted by a 34-year-old Jamara Garcia. The victim had reportedly tried to rescue a dog from the neighborhood prior to the attack. Responding officers found that Garcia had an outstanding felony bench warrant for vandalism. They handcuffed her behind the back and called for paramedics after determining that the woman was under the influence of an unknown intoxicant. The officers later reported that Garcia became non-compliant and combative as they waited for the ambulance. Bystander video would show her falling backwards and seemingly kicking one of the 3 unnamed officers that were restraining her. The cop that was struck then punched Garcia twice in the face in rapid succession. One of the other officers then intervened to shield the woman from his colleague. Garcia was taken to a local hospital for a medical evaluation, but she wasn't reported to have suffered any injuries. She was arrested on suspicion of assault and battery, being under the influence of a controlled but unnamed substance, and resisting arrest. Updates indicated that the power-tripping cop who'd punched her was placed on administrative leave. Number 3. Brianna Strauss. In July of 2022, Officer Brianna Strauss of the Washington Federal Way Police Department uploaded a video to her TikTok in which she boasted about her privileges as a police officer. The woman used explicit language while telling users that they had to get out of the way if they saw an officer following behind them. Strauss went on to state, "I can run 90 miles an hour. You can't do that." The clip went viral after it resurfaced on Reddit later in the summer and eventually rose to over 300,000 views on YouTube. It also amassed millions of views on Twitter, where numerous users criticized Strauss for her perceived superiority. One commenter wrote, "The arrogance is disgusting," a sentiment that others echoed as well. The attention prompted Strauss's department to carry out an investigation into her disciplinary history, but it found no past issues with her behavior. The FDWP consequently determined that Strauss's TikTok violated their code of conduct, and she was suspended for 10 hours without pay. The decision generated further backlash from netizens who argued that the punishment had been too lenient. Number 2. Kendall Kinsey. Multiple officers of the NYPD went to a home in Harlem on August the 12th of 2022 to arrest 22-year-old Elvin James on an attempted murder charge. As shown by cell phone footage, law enforcement was met with resistance by several local residents. One of them was 19-year-old Tamani Crum, whom some sources identified as James's girlfriend. She ran up to NYPD Detective Kendall Kinsey and shoved him in the shoulder as they were standing face to face. The cop responded by throwing a forceful punch to Crum's head, which connected with an audible thud. The teenager was sent flying backwards and hit her head as she stiffly dropped to the sidewalk. She was recorded holding her face while laying on her back as a bystander was heard yelling at Kinsey, "Why would you do that? That's a little girl!" Crum, a Bronx resident, was taken into custody on charges of assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, and obstructing governmental administration. As the video gained attention online, a considerable degree of public outrage, including from Crumb's mother, was directed towards Kinsey, accusing him of being on a power trip and using excessive force. Mayor Eric Adams spoke to the media and stated that the officers at the scene had shown great restraint, given the fact that people were interfering with the arrest of a man who was armed and wanted for attempted murder. It's a whole another kind of trip, but if you're craving more thrilling content, then we have our earlier release on when road trips go wrong, lined up for you right after number one. Number 1. Johnny Cagle. In March of 2022, Rolando Reyes was taking photos at the scene of an accident in Lake Jackson, Texas. He was approached by Officer Johnny Cagle and asked if he had permission to be there. The man told him that he was allowed to be in a public space and take photos. Cagle then asked him to leave and Reyes refused, at which point the former called his colleague, Officer O. Mendoza, who agreed with his assessment of the situation. Cagle then claimed that it was illegal for Reyes to take photos of people's vehicles and license plates, which it wasn't.
What did you say now?
I asked you, why are you here?
I said I'm taking photos.
Okay. Are you allowed on this accident scene? That's what I'm asking you.
You're asking me if I'm allowed to be here?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What do you think?
Okay. I need you to leave, please.
I'm not going to leave.
Mendoza, your accident scene. He's taking pictures of other people's vehicles and license plates, which is against the law.
In fact, as their interaction progressed, a woman closer to the scene was recording it behind them, and the police didn't question her. Cagle then demanded that Reyes identify himself, and he declined, accusing the officers of trying to intimidate him. He also pointed to the fact that the cops should have been dealing with the accident behind them instead of harassing him. Cagle then moved closer to the man, accused him of interfering with an investigation, and demanded he leave. The officers then appeared to charge Reyes before the camera dropped and the video cut off. Reyes was arrested, but according to subsequent updates, he was released without being charged. An internal affairs investigation was launched that found the officers' actions were based on an erroneous understanding of the law. Cagle resigned during the course of the investigation, while Mendoza was given a period of unpaid leave and scheduled for remedial training. Number 7. Susan and William Shmira. 65-year-old Susan Shmira and her 64-year-old husband William left their home in Williamsburg, Virginia on May the 27th of 2018. They had planned for a cross-country vacation that would eventually bring them all the way to Palm Springs, California, a week later. However, what had started as an exciting summer getaway to the sun-soaked shores of one of California's most popular tourist destinations soon turned into an extensive search for the Shmiras, who had gone missing not long after their arrival in Palm Springs. The investigation into their whereabouts began on June the 13th, after the San Bernardino Sheriff's Department received a tip that a vehicle had been parked near the Amboy Crater National Landmark in the Mojave Desert. Since June the 2nd, they soon discovered the car belonged to the Shmiras, and an aviation crew was called in to sweep the area in search of the missing couple. In the days that followed, the Sheriff's Department recruited the help of volunteer searchers to aid in the rescue efforts. A few days after the investigation had begun, the remains of an unidentified male were found. A coroner later confirmed it to be the body of William Shmira, though his wife remained missing for nearly a year. In May of 2019, her body was finally found in the desert, east of the Amboy Crater. The search for Susan had taken so long because of the extreme daytime temperatures typical of the Mojave Desert. The area she was eventually found in occasionally hit highs of 160 degrees Fahrenheit. The autopsies confirmed the Shmiras had passed away due to heat exposure. Number 6. Erica Lloyd. 37-year-old Erica Lloyd, a single mother from California, went missing in a sparsely populated desert region near Joshua Tree National Park. She'd embarked on what she described as a pandemic road trip in the midsummer months of 2020. Her final destination was Joshua Tree, located some 500 miles southeast of her home in the city of Walnut Creek. The trip came as a surprise to her 12-year-old son and her roommates, whom Lloyd hadn't notified of her escapade until she was already walking out the door. She kept in contact with family members for the first couple of days, but the communication ceased on June the 16th. Lloyd had spoken to her mother on the phone that day, but their conversation was extremely peculiar, and the woman had begun to suspect something was wrong. Later that same day, Lloyd's car was found by local police, abandoned and vandalized, near a highway intersection in 29 Palms. She was never heard from again. For 8 months, the authorities combed through the vast California desert, hoping to find clues regarding her whereabouts. The search yielded no concrete results, but on January the 31st of 2021, hikers in Wonder Valley came upon what they believed to be human bones, roughly 10 miles east of 29 Palms. The remains were later identified as belonging to Erica Lloyd. The police investigation into her death found no evidence of foul play, though 2 individuals were arrested on June the 8th of 2021 for stealing her car and moving it to the area where it was eventually found by the police. The theft had reportedly thrown off the authorities' initial search efforts and prolonged the investigation. The most common theory regarding Erica's fatal road trip is that she'd suffered some sort of mental breakdown, stemming from the stress of shutting down her business and homeschooling her son. What exactly led to her death, however, remains a mystery. Number 5. The Thoughtapili Family. Sandeep and Sumaya Thoughtapili of Santa Clarita, California, had taken their 2 children, 12-year-old Siddhant and Sachi, aged 9, on a family road trip up to Portland, Oregon, in late March of 2018. After spending a week there, they planned on meeting up with family in San Jose during the drive back home. The Thoughtapillis never showed up, however, and their relatives hadn't heard from them in 2 days. They reported the family missing to local police. Just a day earlier, witnesses had mentioned seeing a car descend into the Eel River off of Highway 101. There had been torrential downpours and the vehicle slipped off the road, falling down an embankment and landing in the water. The authorities soon realized the car belonged to the Thoughtapillis after 2 bodies were recovered from the scene of the crash. The victims were positively identified as Sandeep and Sachi, but Sumaya and Siddhant were still missing. The river's heavy currents had taken them 6 miles downstream, where their remains were eventually found. The site of the Thoughtapili family's tragic accident was located just 30 miles from the area of the Eel River, where another deadly crash had occurred just 1 month prior. Number 4. Joseph Sivith and Amanda Caldwell. The families of 30-year-old Joseph Sivith and Amanda Caldwell, aged 29, were thrust into a tailspin of panic when the couple mysteriously went missing in January of 2019. Suspicions arose after Caldwell, a resident of Greensburg, Pennsylvania, had failed to show up to work on the morning of Thursday, the 3rd. She hadn't called off of her shift and her cell phone was later found in her apartment. Her friends and co-workers claimed it was quite unusual for her to cut off communication and abandon her phone in such a manner. Caldwell's family quickly reported her missing. Sivith's whereabouts were also unknown at the time, as he had called out of work early Thursday morning. He too was reported missing by his family, and an investigation was then launched by Greensburg police. They had very little information to go on, but they were able to track the use of Caldwell's credit card to a small town close to Charleston, South Carolina, which was roughly 600 miles south of her home in Greensburg. It was speculated that Caldwell had been kidnapped by her boyfriend when Sivith's car was found parked behind her home, and the police found traces of blood on its steering wheel. Both families feared for the worst. Their concerns dissipated, however, when an interstate search for the couple resulted in them being found on a so-called spontaneous vacation in South Carolina. The blood on Sivith's steering wheel had apparently come from a cut on his hand. While everyone was relieved to find the couple alive and well, some called the Greensburg Police Department's actions into question, saying their search efforts were premature, especially considering the missing persons were 2 adults. Number 3. Harry Devitt. The dismembered body of 32-year-old New York native Harry Devitt was found on the side of the road in a small desert town in Mexico. In July of 2014, just 6 months prior, Devitt had been reported missing by his girlfriend. The last contact she'd had with him was in the form of a chilling text where Devitt said he was being escorted out of an area that was too dangerous for him to be in. He was riding his motorcycle from his home in the US all the way down to Brazil for the 2014 World Cup, but had gotten caught up in a section of Mexico fraught with gang violence and drug cartel activity. According to a Mexican newspaper called Excelsior, Devitt was kidnapped by a gang called Los Guerreros and was subsequently murdered. His severed body parts were put into multiple trash bags, and he was left next to the road alongside his bike and bags filled with marijuana and cocaine. It's unclear whether Los Guerreros had tried to sell Devitt these drugs, as such illegal transactions are known to occur between Mexican gangs and American tourists. Devitt had been documenting his journey on a website called A New Yorker Travels. He'd hoped to chronicle his intercontinental adventure from beginning to end, but the tragic conclusion to his story came far sooner than he could have anticipated. Number 2. Ryan Bogan and Molly Bach. Frantic friends and family of a couple from South Salt Lake, Utah, reported them missing to local police on April the 17th of 2019. Ryan Bogan and Molly Bach, a pair of recently engaged 27-year-olds, had suddenly disappeared without a trace. The cars were not in the driveway, while their dog, a pit bull named Sadie, was gone as well. Concerned friends' attempts to contact the couple proved futile. Ryan's phone had been turned off, and Molly's was left behind at their home. Missing persons flyers were distributed all throughout the couple's neighborhood and other parts of South Salt Lake. The police eventually located Molly's car and towed it to the station as evidence. Just as the investigation was starting to produce results, the couple was found in Arizona. They had taken an unplanned road trip down south to visit family and hadn't told anyone about it. News of their safety spread through their local community, much to the relief of loved ones who'd been worried about their whereabouts. Number 1. The Trump family. In late August of 2016, the Trump family packed up their car and headed out into the scenic Australian countryside. To the outside world, it appeared to be a pleasant getaway, but as members of the Trump family started randomly appearing one by one in different locations around the country, the truth behind their sudden excursion began to reveal itself. As it turns out, the Trump parents, 51-year-old Mark and 53-year-old Jacoba, had grown increasingly unstable in the months and weeks leading up to their road trip. The couple ran a successful landscaping company in a little town just outside of Melbourne, and also operated a profitable red currant farm on their property. They had created a good life for themselves and their 3 children, Brianna, Mitchell, and Ella, all of whom were in their 20s at the time of the family trip. The financial security that the Trumps had obtained through their various business ventures became a gateway for them to develop the delusion that someone was after them and their money. They truly believed that they were in imminent danger, so they fled. They left behind everything that might be used to track their location, including credit cards and cell phones. Their son Mitchell thought his parents were being irrational, but he went along with them to make sure they stayed safe. He smuggled his phone aboard the car, but once his parents discovered this, they forced him to toss it out the window. After traveling with them for roughly 500 miles, Mitchell asked to be dropped off in a town near Sydney. Later that same day, the 2 daughters, Brianna and Ella, left their parents behind, stole a car, and drove to the nearest town. They reported their parents as missing to local authorities. Ella returned home shortly thereafter, and she became the first member of the Trump family to be located since their abrupt disappearance. Mitchell arrived home a day later. Brianna was ultimately found by a truck driver who had discovered her stowed away in the back of his vehicle. She had suffered some sort of psychological trauma, as she had trouble telling the driver who she was or what had happened to her. At some point along the way, Mark and Jacoba had gotten separated themselves. Jacoba was spotted wandering aimlessly through a Victorian town, dazed and confused, while her husband wasn't found until a few days later. By this time, an interstate search for the missing Trumps had been set in motion, and Mark was eventually found lying on the side of the road near Wangaratta Airport. The case of the missing Trump family had become a national curiosity. Over the course of the week-long search, there were a number of theories and rumors in circulation as to why they had left their home in the first place. Some thought chemicals on their farm had severely altered their grasp on reality, prompting them to flee in a panic. The police proposed that the family had suffered some sort of sheer delusion. Nobody knows what really happened to cause such mental distress to an entire family. That's why it's been referred to as one of the most bizarre public meltdowns of modern times. But the Trumps themselves have since done their best to move on and return to their normal lives as if nothing had ever happened. Thanks for watching. Would you rather be harassed by a cop on a power trip or live without electric power for a week? Let us know in the comments section below.